time is one of those things, how we use time, spend time, create time, what we make time for. Like, time is one of those things that, of course, is, and the way we use it, an essential part of all of our lives. And I think when we're talking about simplicity or clarity, I think one of the biggest things we lack simplicity and clarity on is time. And for me, I've definitely noticed how over life, especially when your book came out, I've tried to remove people from having to live their life based on a timeline. Or an expectation. And I realized that because my life went in a completely different direction, whereby I became a monk at 22 and didn't have my first job until 26. And today lead one of the most meaningful, fulfilling lives in the world, thanks to all my experiences. And so it's fascinating. There were times in my life where I felt like I was behind people that I should be in line with. There are times in my life where I felt I was ahead of people. There are times when I felt like I was trying to figure it out. And I think a lot of people usually feel like they're behind, ahead, or equal to. And that's kind of how we make sense of stuff. And that's why when this book came out, which I know was like maybe a year and a half ago, maybe even a couple of years ago now, to me, I was fascinated that you were able to pinpoint, and go so deeply into time, which I always thought was so much more fluid. And so I guess the first question I want to ask you, and please take this wherever you like don't feel constricted at all, because I like what we're kind of co-creating right now. What fascinates you about time the most that you are so deeply drawn to actually write a whole book about timing?
Yeah, so that is actually, I'm going to put the answer to that in more of the mundane category. The reason for the impetus for it was just frustration. More than anything else. It wasn't any kind of deep conceptual fascination. So here we are. I'm talking to you from this is my office here in Washington, D.C. It's the refurbished one-car garage behind my house. I live there, like right there. And so I would come to my office and do work. And at a certain point, I realized like I'd have a to-do list. And maybe I would have appointments on the calendar, but I wasn't intentional at all about when I was doing stuff. Well, I would write when I felt like writing. I would make phone calls when I felt like making phone calls. I would do interviews when I felt like doing interviews. And I wasn't intentional about it. And I said, that's crazy. That's crazy. Like I end up. I'm actually a fairly kind of rational. I like to think I am at least a fairly rational, evidence-based guy. And I'm making these decisions about when to do things. I'm not even making decisions. I'm just kind of stumbling my way into it. And so I said, well, there's got to be some guidance out there on like when we should do things. And I found to my surprise that there wasn't. And that got me really curious. I said, well, I wonder if anybody's ever researched this. So I started looking around for research, and it turned out there was a huge amount of research on this question, but it was splattered all over the place. It was in literally 24 different domains. So it wasn't like you say, oh, there's a sociologist who studies timing. Well, there might be, there are, but there are also biologists who do that. There are economists who've studied that. There are microbiologists who have studied epidemiologists. There's a whole field called chronobiology. And so what you had was literally 24 different fields asking very similar, in some cases, identical questions. And what I said is like, maybe, it was painful, but if I go wide enough and deep enough into this research, I can begin to piece together the evidence-based ways to make better, smarter decisions about when to do things in a given day. But also to your other point, Jay, when we think about our lives are episodic. Episodes have beginnings, episodes have middles, and episodes have ends. It's the whole idea of the journey metaphor you introduced earlier is like journeys have beginnings, they have middles, and they have ends. And it turns out that there is some fascinating research on how our cognitive abilities change over the course of a day. And then more episodically, how beginnings affect us, how midpoints affect us, how endings affect us. There's research on how groups coordinate in time. There's research on how the way we think about time affects our behavior. There's research, again, all roads lead back to linguistics. There's research based on the way that languages configure their verb tenses. It can predict people's savings behavior, as crazy as that sounds. So it ends up being something that is, going back to another one of your words, it ends up being essential. It ends up being fundamental because we are temporal creatures. That is, we have we talk about colloquially about biological clocks, about a biological clock. But essentially, what we know from biology is that, especially chronobiology, is that we essentially have clocks in every cell in our body. I mean, we are walking timepieces. And again, depending on your notion of time, sort of philosophically, existentially, we are in some ways moving through time. At the very least, our conversation began in the past. It's going to end in the future, right? The people who are going to listen to the recorded version of this are listening to something that happened in the past, but those people haven't done anything yet because that's in the future. And so we're sort of swimming in this essential element of our lives. And so what I was just trying to do is just make it understandable.
Yeah, and I think you did a phenomenal job. And so I want to dive into different parts of it. I guess my first question is there's a few things. So the first one is, I think the most common relationship, and of course I'm making a huge assumption here, but I think maybe we'll agree, maybe your research will say something else, but I'd say my assumption is that the most common relationship, and I believe everyone has a relationship with money, we have a relationship with time, we have a relationship with anything, knowledge, wisdom, etc. And so our relationship with time for most people is, I always feel like I don't have enough, right? That is a very clear relationship that we all have with time, where it's like, I don't have enough time. I can't make enough time. I can't find time. Like we say all these words, which are all about making, finding, creating, having. What does that do? What is that mindset toward time? How does that actually affect our behavior?
Our relationship with time, we can think of it as an ally. We can think of it as an enemy in some ways. That's oversimplifying in that case. But I think what we're trying to, and one way to make time your ally rather than your enemy, is to recognize the effect, often invisible, that it has on your life. So if you look, so I'll give you an example. What we know from, let's just take the unit of a day. What we know very clearly from a whole array of research is that our brain power does not remain constant over the course of a day. Our brain power changes over the course of a day. So doing something at 9 a.m. is not the same as doing something at 3 p.m., period, full stop. Now, there's some complexity underneath that, but the main idea is that our brain power doesn't remain constant over the course of a day. And the best time to do something depends on what it is you're actually doing. So once you understand those kinds of hidden invisible rules, you can begin to make time your ally rather than your enemy, and end up mitigating some of those feelings that one never has enough time. So I think that's part of what it is. People who feel like they don't have enough time, this is not something I write about, but I'll opine about it anyway. In many cases, people who don't feel like they have enough time, sometimes, not always, sometimes it's not a sufficiency of time issue. It's a sufficiency of priority issue. What they actually don't have any clarity about their purpose or their priorities. And so they're moving in all kinds of, that's not always the case, but I think that's partly the case. The other thing that we know is that when time becomes extremely salient in our lives, we underperform. And I'll give you, in certain circumstances, or we're unhappy in certain circumstances. So a great example of that is in professional services, but particularly in the practice of law, is the billable hour. What we know, so if you are a lawyer practicing in a law firm, not working for the government or doing that, or a nonprofit or something, you bill yourself out by the hour. And so what you do is that you have, a way to, well, I'm going analog here, but you have on your computer or scribbled down an account of what you're doing, literally in some cases in 6-minute increments. And what we know from research there is that is incredibly thwarting to people's sense of autonomy. So there are all kinds of things in our relationship with time that if we reconfigure it, we can feel a little bit better, do a little bit more and better.
Yeah, that's spot on. I think that makes that answer and all the parts will make a lot of sense. I think the part that I get really interested by when we start talking about time in the way you just did now, where you talk about priorities, you're talking about the ally versus the enemy, and I love that. Is productivity even the goal of time? Because I feel like today, one of the biggest challenges that I get asked, at least, and maybe your children experience this, or maybe what I see outside in the world of social media, is a lot of people today spend a lot of time overthinking and procrastinating. And that's seen as a negative thing. And people are often like scared of overthinking, scared of procrastinating, or they judge themselves and then they start getting into this kind of like, vicious circle and cycle of feeling like, oh, like I'm wasting a lot of time here. Tell me about what you found, or even your thoughts on productivity as a goal of time versus the effective use, if possible, of procrastination and overthinking.
Procrastination and productivity. Okay, let's talk about what productivity is. I'm going to be literal with this here. Productivity is the amount of units you produce over a given amount of time. Yep. So it is inherently time-based because time is in the denominator of productivity. Okay, so again, I'm not sure that productivity is necessarily the best measure. I say that as a writer. Okay, so I could be suppose I wrote more words per hour today versus yesterday, I would literally be more productive. But am I a better writer? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Like, what are the words, right? Yeah. And so in some ways, productivity is the notion of productivity in that very literal sense is an artifact of our being an economy where we were producing identical mass-produced goods, and so efficiency was the highest value because everything was the same. And so what you wanted to do was, in a given denominator, make the numerator larger. Okay, that's how you increase. That's a way to increase productivity, or keep the numerator the same and shrink the amount of time in the denominator. So that's what productivity is. I think a way to a looser way to measure things is quality and quality, contribution, impact, those sorts of things. And certainly for certain kinds of professions, like being a writer, writing more words is no measure of my contribution to the world.
Yeah. So if anyone's listening or watching right now and it's like, Dan, I just feel like I procrastinate a lot, I overthink a lot, and I waste time. What would be your response to that?
Okay, so that's the productivity thing. Now let's talk about procrastination, because we know a lot about procrastination. Okay, two big ideas here. One, procrastination is not always bad. Okay, sometimes you're procrastinating for a reason, because you haven't worked it out, because you're still incubating an idea. Okay, so it's not inherently bad. It's not like all procrastination is bad. The second big idea here is that procrastination is basically, in general, the downside, negative procrastination is just an emotion regulation problem, right? It has nothing to do with time. It means that you are unwilling to confront something, and therefore something is so disturbing to you that you would rather actually sabotage yourself than confront it. That in some ways you're making a quasi-rational decision that the pain of confronting, man, can I really write this, is greater than actually not writing it in the first place. And so we know this from a lot of research. Procrastination is an emotion regulation issue. And so what you have to think about is, what is the emotion that you're avoiding? And is there a small step? Is there a way in some ways to trick yourself into either confronting it directly or to do something to just get yourself going, and that the action ends up confronting the emotion? But a lot of times, but again, in certain circumstances, it's hard to say. The fact that you're not ready to start is a signal that it might be a very, very positive signal. It could mean that, hey, I'm still incubating this.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I love that perception, because I think as soon as you start labeling and going, oh, my procrastination's bad and this is not a good place to be in, you're right. All of that is just avoiding the actual emotion, which is a signal or a sign or an alert that's kind of trying to get your attention. And you just keep putting it away. And I think what that leads to, and this is something which I found fascinating in the book, it's like starting things. Like, I feel like, knowing when to start a business or knowing when to start a project is like the hardest thing in the world. And, I'm sure you get asked this a million times, but like, tell us about the research behind starting something and what you found was most critical there.
Again, there's very rarely prospectively a perfect time to start something. All right. But there are ways to give ourselves a little bit of a different a little bit of a psychological edge. And this is the work of Katie Milkman, Jason Reese, and Heng-Chen Dai. They did it at Penn, University of Pennsylvania. And they had this idea of what they call the fresh start effect. And a way to understand the fresh start effect is like this: that certain dates, certain days, certain dates are what social psychologists call temporal landmarks. Temporal landmarks. That is, they stand out in time the way a physical landmark stands out in space. So again, back to the journey metaphor. You're navigating your way. You're trying to find your way. Oh, there's a landmark. I know where I am. Oh, there's that building. I have a sense of where I am. Temporal landmarks are navigational tools in some ways. But certain temporal landmarks have a peculiar psychological effect. What they do is essentially they operate as kind of a restart. What they say is that on certain days that are fresh start days, you essentially relegate your previous bad self to the past and open up a fresh ledger on your new self. All right. And so there's certain days that actually you're more likely to start something and you're more likely to succeed while starting it. So what does this mean? Let's be concrete here. If you want to start something, you're probably better off doing it on a Monday rather than on a Thursday. You're probably better doing it on the day after your birthday rather than 3 days before your birthday. You're probably better doing it on the first day of summer rather than 3 days before the first day of summer. Let's say you're if one is a religiously observant, the day after or the day of a religious holiday rather than 4 days before that religious holiday. And so you can, in some ways, have that sense of where you are temporally and pick the right date to start something.
Yeah, I can so relate to that. And my problem is I'll try to start something on a Monday, I'll fail on Tuesday, and then I wait till the next Monday to start.
Okay. Okay, so that's a mixed bag. Yeah. That's a mixed bag. It depends on how deep the failure was on depends on how deep the failure was on Tuesday. Now, there's another strategy for all of this.
Yeah, please.
Which on all of this, I mean, it's reasonably well known, and in some ways, it's interesting, Jay, because I think it's analogous to our conversation about simplicity and the opposite of simplicity, or simplicity and complexity. In that, I do think that in many cases we have been seduced into the idea of moonshots and big, hairy, audacious goals. Mm-hmm. I think that they're important. But I think that they're oversold in a way. And what's undersold, just think about it as a pricing issue. Okay. So the big, hairy, audacious goals, moonshots, I think they're overvalued. And I think what's undervalued is small wins. And once again, there's a lot of evidence of that, starting from Carl Weick 30 years ago. Small wins are enormously important, because what small wins do is that small wins can overcome that procrastination problem. Small wins can then lead to other small wins and other small wins that cascade into something bigger. So a strategy for overcoming procrastination, a strategy for many things, is to go for small wins. Let me give you an example of that. So the one strategy that I've heard of, I called it this. It's not originally for me. It's just sort of out there. I call it J5, not J-A-Y, but J, letter J. And that's just that, and that stands for just 5 more. Okay. And so if you don't feel like doing something, you say, okay, you know what I'm going to do? Okay. So I'm doing some research right now. Okay. I got these papers. Some of them are incredibly boring. Okay. You know what? I can't stand it. I want to quit. You know what? I'll just read 5 more pages. Just 5 more pages. I'll read that. Okay. Yeah. Oh my God. I got a boatload of email here. I can't deal with it. I just want to go inside and have a drink. You know what? I'm going to just do 5 more. 5 more emails, and we'll do that. You know what? I'm tired of writing. Okay, just 5 more sentences. That's it. And that can get us going, give you a small win. And what happens a lot of times is that just 5 more becomes just 10 more, just 20 more, something like that.
I really like that one. That's an awesome strategy. I think that's a great.
Yeah, it's very simple. I use it all the time. I'm not joking around. I use it today. When I looked at my email file and I was like, oh God. I can't bear it's like, okay, I've already answered enough email. I'm like, okay, just 5 more. And you know what I did? I did that and I got it done. And I probably ended up answering 8 or something like that. Another one, a very well-known technique. I use it. I have no shame in using it. You're probably familiar with it. Your listeners are probably familiar with it. Is the Pomodoro technique, which is Pomodoro is Italian for tomato. And so, you set a timer. I have one on my computer that I use on very dark days. set a timer for whatever. I do it for 25 minutes, and like I just can't bear this. Okay, I can't research this anymore. I can't read this anymore. I'm sick of writing. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. It's 25 minute. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to do it for that 25 minutes. And that can, and that can, and I think, let me extract from this, as always, a large theoretical lesson. And it's this, all right, that a lot of times in our understanding of what makes human beings tick, we think that belief precedes action, that you have to convince yourself, and then that is the impetus to act. And in many cases, more cases than we realize, the arrow runs in the other direction. That getting yourself to act can actually trigger the belief.
Yes.
And that's a very, very important, very important lesson.
That's so true. And that's really, it's kind of like when we're like, I can't make my mind up, right? Like even that saying is exactly in that belief where you're just spending so much time trying to make your mind up and decide something. And what I love about what you just said is around that whole, the small wins element of just, I always feel like when you can get into a good rhythm and pattern of keeping promises to yourself and keeping small commitments to yourself, you start to trust yourself. And when you start to trust yourself, you can then trust yourself with bigger tasks. The problem is, like you said, is that we go for these moonshot goals and naturally we fail at them. And therefore we don't trust ourselves. And I feel like self-trust is like the big issue when it comes with time, is that you're like, well, do I even trust myself with this much time? Do I even trust myself to complete that? And you're right about the small wins, whether it's making your bed or just 5 more, or, you know, all of these principles that you're laying out, like that just builds trust with yourself.
I'll give you something else that builds trust with yourself that's related to this concept, which is, again, is research-based. It's built on, I've written about this. I wrote about it in that book. I've talked about it before, is the work of Teresa Mobile at Harvard Business School. And she found that the single biggest day-to-day motivator on the job is making progress and meaningful work. Okay, so the days we're making progress, the days we're motivated, we come back the next day feeling motivated. But one of the challenges is that we often don't have a good sense of how much progress we're making. And so one of the things that I've done for like 8 or 9 years now is at the end of every day I have a call it a progress ritual. And all I do is I just basically say what'd you get done today? And I just list what I got done today, and I keep a record of that. And I have to say, I almost never look at the list. but it's the act of doing. I mean, seriously, I almost never look at the list, but it's the act of doing it. So I just take a moment. It's a ritual. All right. And, you know, I don't have to tell you, former monk, the importance of rituals in human understanding. Right. So it's a ritual. It's a punctuation mark at the end of the day. What'd you get done today, Dan? Okay. This is what I got done. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-ba. Okay.
I love that. How do you do that for other people? So if you're leading teams, if you've got a small team, a big team, a company, how do you kind of help people realize the progress they're making? Because I